The American presidential election occurs in 79 days, and things are as bad as they get until they get worse. Every American Social Security number has been stolen and posted for sale. The economy is worse than the 1970s, and the world's hotspots are actually on fire. Israel is systematically eliminating the occupants of the Gaza enclave and trying to draw the US, UK, and France into a war with Iran. Russia is trying, and failing, to occupy Ukraine, and China is threatening to annex Taiwan. The American Navy has admitted defeat by the Houthis and cannot secure shipping lanes in the Middle East. Google is being accused of election interference by the Department of Justice. Great Britain, Germany, and other so-called Western nations are resurrecting fascism under the guise of public safety. Will our future chief diplomat be able to handle these problems? One of the candidates believes he is ordained by God, and the other candidate actually was ordained by the 1%. One candidate's foreign policy is, why can't we use nuclear weapons? And the other candidate's foreign policy is unknown because she refuses to hold a press conference. Welcome to Incontinence 2024, because when all is said and done, everyone is going to need a wardrobe change. I am Mark Jacobin, along with my brother James, and this is Extemporaneously. James, how would you characterize the upcoming election?
Mark, I was having a relatively good morning until I heard your statement there. Hold on, I'm calling my therapist right now on the other line. To characterize the upcoming election, I would say this. There's a lot of gloom and doom in what you're saying there, but the NFL football season kicks off in a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to be able to be a guest on your show anymore because I just won't give a shit at that point.
And thus we know the reason for America's preoccupation with sports.
Guilty. I spent more time working on my fantasy football team this morning than prepping for this show. That's where my priorities lie, because between that and whatever barbiturates I can get my hands on, to just not think about everything you went over there. The importance of this election, I'll say this, Mark. I will say this. I miss Joe Biden already. Back in the year of our Lord last month, can we redo this whole thing and get Joe back and possibly not have J.D. Vance or Tim Walz?
Jeez.
I understand Vice President Harris. It's more or less out of necessity. I don't. But to answer the question right off the bat, this election, Mark, is not the most important election of all time. And it's not going to be the last election if Trump wins from Rikers Island. It is easily the worst election of this century, and probably the two most inept campaigns I've seen run in my lifetime. And it probably is right up there with Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford in 1976. The state of this election is terrible. It's god-awful. Neither of these candidates have a basic understanding of civics. The good news is the Democratic Party switched their fridge magnet bumper sticker of Trump is Hitler. If we don't beat him in a Democratic election, there won't be another Democratic election, even though he won a Democratic election 8 years ago and lost one 4 years ago. They've switched to trying to talk about policy. And Trump has met Vice President there, right there in kindergarten civics. I have to correct you on one thing, Mark. Kamala Harris did create a policy position for herself, although not a foreign policy position. Her first domestic policy statement was this, and I quote, "We need to cap food prices."
Well,
okay.
I'm glad she's carrying a page out of Nikita Khrushchev's playbook, because that works so well.
Right. Thanks for coming, Vice President Harris. Please see Bobby Kennedy Jr. at Central Park to pick up the dead bear. And then Donald Trump, whatever aversion he has to military veterans, pops up every now and then. And this is just 2 days ago, and I quote, "I think the people that win the Civilian Medal of Valor is more important than people that win or get awarded and receive the Medal of Honor for congressional, or not congressional, but combat." because most of those people are dead. The people that win the civilian version of the word are alive. Now, Mark, that's the whole statement. That's it. That's all there was. That's all he said.
So presumably what he's trying to convey is that these wonderful people are alive to continue doing their wonderful works.
I'm going to say it's a cousin to what he said about John McCain.
What did Abraham Lincoln say? Something about the last full measure of devotion. The reason these people receive these awards is because they gave their lives for the greater good, whether that was a person that was one person greater than them or 10 people.
Yeah, I just don't think former President Trump has an appreciation for military veterans nor people who actually do get killed in combat on behalf of this country, because, he chickened out of the Vietnam War like 6 times. So he doesn't quite understand how this all works, apparently. So, Mark, the entirety of this show, you could have just kept talking for another 20 minutes about everything that's wrong. So let me just recap this. Taiwan's about to be invaded. Ukraine was invaded. Israel is attempting, for pretty much unknown reasons, to burn the whole world down before the election. What is this about the economy being worse than the 1970s?
It's worse than the 1970s because there's nowhere to go from here. Because in the 1970s, the magical Ronald Reagan solved the economic problem the way we've been trying to solve it for the last 40 years, which is to print more money. And printing money is a great way to solve your problem in the short term. But as we've seen over the last 6 or 8 years, we've saturated the global economy with US dollars. And printing more money, which always incurs debt, by the way, separate show, but for every dollar we print, we incur $1.08 of debt. There's nowhere to go. And the things that drove the economy for the last 30 years, especially with the emergence of China onto the global market, those factors are no longer relevant. So, although the answers to the economy weren't apparent in the 1970s, we know a lot more about it now than we did then. And if it gets better from here on out, it will be pure luck, and I'm not relying too much on that.
Well, that's rather uplifting. But Mark, I keep hearing from, I'm going to call him former President Joe Biden, because whoever's making the decisions now, it's certainly not him. He recently said in a slurred statement that the infrastructure bill and all the other American Recovery Acts are working. The economy is better than it's ever been. He's created more jobs than any president in history. And he's going to ride off into the sunset. The stock market's at an all-time high, they tell me. Everything is great. So, Mark, if it's that great, according to the current president, his vice president, who helped him craft these policies, and by Vice President Harris's own admission, she was in the room for every major decision. So,
as were several flies, I'm told.
As were several flies on the wall. I want to congratulate the 47th president, Secretary of State Blinken, who is running the country, apparently. Mark, something is wrong with this statement I'm about to make. If current President Joe Biden, running the country from retirement, says 2 days ago that the infrastructure bill is working, that's why the economy is so well, and inflation is going down, why does his current vice president and presumptive Democratic nominee, Vice President Harris, have to come out and say we need to cap prices? These two things, Mark, they don't match. Why is it necessary to cap food prices in a Soviet-style crackdown if the infrastructure bill and the Rebuild America bill and the most legislation passed since Lyndon Johnson is working? Is there a disconnect between current President Biden's ego and a demand for his own legacy, and Vice President Harris having to partially live in the reality and run away from the Biden-Harris record? Because Harris is trying to do a slippery thing here. She's trying to be the vice president, but also run away from the policies that have her name on them, and say that the answer to the policies that she was in the room for is now price caps, which the audience can look up a word called scarcity to see how bad that would go. Even the Washington Post wrote an editorial calling her silly. But why is it necessary to cap food prices if the current policies of the last 3 years are working?
It has, I would say that it's not coming from a position of contact with reality. And this isn't exclusive to Kamala Harris. Politicians seldom have contact with reality, but they do place a superstitious level of belief in opinion polls. And if opinion polls are saying, hey, the common person tells me that the food prices are too high, we need to give them a soundbite to make them feel like we're going to fix things. So if the opinion polls say prices are too high, the politician says, I will fix food prices. I don't believe there's necessarily any direct correlation to reality. I don't think Kamala has struggled to put food on her table for a number of years, if ever, and probably doesn't even know anybody who does or has.
Well, she did work at McDonald's in college, Mark. That's how she's relating to the working class.
Yes.
Okay. So basically, this election is not being held in the United States of America. It's being held in the United States of Gaslight Central. Because you have Trump still gaslighting his followers about getting screwed in the 2020 election. And you have Harris saying that she wasn't the border czar. She doesn't want to eliminate the immigration department, that she doesn't want to do a gun recall, a mandatory gun recall. The civics problem with these two people is insane. Another question I would have for anyone, because I looked this up in my kindergarten civics book that I still have. How exactly do you cap food prices? Do you write an executive order for that? No, because that doesn't cover the food industry. Do you pass a law through Congress to cap food prices? Is that even constitutional? What power invested in the executive branch, if Harris prevails, allows you to cap food prices? Now, in a time of war, such as World War II, you can, because the president has extraordinary powers, you can cap steel prices, you can order rationing, any time of war that Congress has approved. I'm just wondering how this mechanically works with our government as it's currently configured as a democratic republic.
Well, James,
how do you cap food prices?
I would say that you haven't been following along. The answer is very clear, and anyone who's been following American politics for the last 40 years would know this. You declare war on the economy, thus enabling wartime powers. I mean, we have a war on drugs, right? We have war on the American federal government has a war on pretty much everything out there. So it's time that we all acknowledge the elephant in the room and declare war on the economy.
Because declaring war on inanimate objects has been working since the 1960s, when we declared war on poverty, and in order, a war on drugs, a war on terror, and now a war on the economy. This is
hey, that's the one thing we do best. We invade and we destroy, right?
Invade and we destroy ourselves. Because I think if the war on poverty would have worked, we wouldn't be having this discussion. If the war on drugs would have worked, we wouldn't know what fentanyl is. And if the war on terror would have worked, we wouldn't have stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years and built back the Taliban better than they ever were. And now the new war on the economy is coming. And I want to be very fair here today with the delusions of the very civic-minded Vice President Harris, not to be outdone by her opponent, former President Trump, who released, and I swear to God he did this, his honor pledge of the 20 things he would do for America. Now, I don't have time to get through them all on this show because, again, I'd be choking on a pretzel. But let's just go with number one on the list. I'm going to deport more people from America than in the history of the world. Okay, again, what power are you going to execute to do that? Now, you do have a right. The federal government does run immigration. Trump tried this in 2016. And I don't know about you, but that 2,000-mile border wall, I haven't seen it. I mean, there is a quarter mile built here or there. What is he going to do differently this time to do this? I understand that he would have the right as the president to enforce current immigration law. But functionally, how is this going to work? It's not. So the point here is our new Democratic nominee, Harris, doesn't even understand how supply and demand works, doesn't even understand how basic supply chain issues work, doesn't understand anything. Otherwise, she never would have said that. And you have Trump, who is so fixated, like an alcoholic looking for another drink on the border, that he's now again promising to do something that can't be done. So this is why I say this is the worst election of all time. The worst. And I don't think there's a close second place.
On the plus side, we have been informed by the Trump campaign that Trump is better looking than Kamala Harris. So we have that going for us.
Oh, well, I guess. I mean, maybe secretly he dresses up in drag and does comparisons. I warned the Trump supporters of this before he got shot, that although he's performing far better than Biden, and at that time was acting presidential for a brief moment in time, and then he had this opportunity to connect as a human being to the humanity of the fact that he was almost shot, or that he was shot and nearly killed. And unlike Reagan, who became more in touch with his own vulnerability and his own mortalness, Trump took this as, oh, I'm
and
the
started
savior
printing money like there was no tomorrow.
Yeah, Donald Trump should be running Vice President Harris off the political electoral map. He should be winning 40 states with 55% of the popular vote. The vice president is that bad at campaigning. She has no understanding of the middle ground in middle American politics. Now, the election will now be tighter because Biden's out, and so you'll get some excitement about Harris. She needs to win Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, period. These are the people that votes are up for grabs in. Everyone who's going to vote for Trump is going to vote for Trump. Everyone who's going to vote for the Democratic nominee, no matter who it is going to vote for them. That small slice of people who are affected by these policies the most don't want to hear from Trump about Medal of Honor winners versus Medal of Valor winners. They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear from Harris that their food prices are going to be capped, destroying their economy even more in that region. It is beyond I can't even figure out how we got here to where these are the choices set before the American public. Kamala Harris could not get elected the president of her college class. And Donald Trump very well may be crazy. And I mean, actually crazy.
I believe that's true. I believe he suffers from a number of unreported personality disorders. But what I think is more concerning to me, because the structure of the United States is such that the federal government can be inept, largely inept, and the states will govern themselves as they usually do, in the absence of idiotic, insane, and unfathomable things such as price caps. But if you look at the state of the world today, I don't think either of these presidents is equipped to enter the world stage and manage these problems to a satisfactory outcome. And by satisfactory outcome, I mean not blowing up the world. And it does seem that for the last 4 years, America has been asleep at the wheel, because Israel is doing whatever the hell it wants to. And usually we've kept them under our thumb, making sure that they're not going to allow someone to turn the Middle East into a sheet of glass. We have Europe running amok, at the same time issuing sanctions against Russia, but buying their gas through the back door. How are either of these people going to enter the world stage and address the problems that very soon will become our problems if they're not addressed?
Well, the answer is they're not. They're just not going to. And what's going to happen is the bureaucracy is going to take over. The bureaucracy is running the country now because Biden is not capable at the moment. And they're going to have to take over because negotiations have to be held with China, over Taiwan. Negotiations have to be held with Putin over Ukraine. Negotiations have to be held in the Gaza Strip. And that's just a few of them, Mark. There's hot spots in near economic disaster all over the globe. The chief job, constitutionally, of the American president is to run foreign policy. The Congress, specifically the House, is supposed to run the budget. That's why the founders gave the power of the purse to Congress, is they create the budget for the country, handle things domestically. The Supreme Court says whether or not it's constitutional, and the president's job is foreign policy. That's their chief job, is to deal with the rest of the world. Donald Trump is not saying how he's going to handle these problems. He's just saying that Kamala Harris is ugly, that she's stupid, and that he's better looking than her. And Kamala Harris is also not presenting a foreign policy platform, either on their website, through surrogates, or through interviews, or any other forum whatsoever, on how specifically to give the American people a choice, how specifically she would deal with Netanyahu in the Gaza Strip, how specifically you would deal with Putin, how specifically you would handle the Taiwan situation. And that's simply foreign policy. How you'd handle the fact that Saudi Arabia is no longer, after 50 years, going to be selling oil on the dollar. They're now a free agent. They're looking for a better deal from us. They're talking to China, and they're thinking about going to the euro. These are massive, massive situations. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And we went to war. We went to war to protect Saudi Arabia, remember, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's correct.
We still have thousands of Gulf War veterans suffering from Gulf War syndrome after our attempts to protect Saudi Arabia from invasion by Iraq.
Yes, and there's a character dead to history now, Osama bin Laden, who did not like the American troops stationed in the Holy Land, which might have set a chain of events in motion that led to September 11th. And I really just want to thank the current administration for reminding Saudi Arabia of that, as they bitch slap us over and over again.
And to add insult to injury, last week, President Biden, or somebody who got a hold of his RoboPen, authorized the sale of offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia.
Right, to fight the proxy war in Yemen between the Iranians, supported by the Houthis, and Saudi Arabia itself. So, and this is the same President Biden who, when he was running for president 3.5 short years ago, I don't know if you'll remember that he said this, that he was more or less going to put Saudi Arabia in a box. He was going to cut ties with them. He was going to right-size that relationship. And now he's begging them to stay on the dollar, and he's giving them weapons in a quid pro quo to stay on the dollar. Because, Mark, if that happens, if oil starts getting sold not on the dollar, you're better at economics than me. But again, my kindergarten civics student tells me I'm doing some basic math here. That's bad news for us because it devalues the dollar.
It's bad news for us not because of our exports. It's bad news for us because the reason we have maintained the highest standard of living overall for the last 70 years is that the dollar is the primary reserve currency. Every other country wants the dollar. They have to do business in the dollar. That's why they buy dollars and then do business purchasing things like petroleum. This is just one more nail in the coffin as the dollar, in the nail of the coffin as the dollar as the reserve currency. There are lots of things going on right now where lots of companies, or lots of countries are moving away from the dollar. Saudi Arabia moving away from the dollar, mathematically speaking, may not be a big deal, but it will have an outsized impact on other people who are considering abandoning the dollar.
So the effect would be on the smaller, marginalized countries that we do business with. Their buying power, although minimal now, would go down even further?
No, they would be incentivized to move away from the dollar, move on to the euro or the ruble. A lot of Russian oil is already traded in rubles. Russia trades oil with Iran in rubles. This is a problem. People have probably read about BRICS or heard about BRICS. A lot of these things are organizations where people are saying, look, we want to move away from American hegemony. We're tired of America, and especially American corporations, coming in, taking our resources and leaving us holding the bag. And so While America is so focused on whether or not Russia reacquires Ukraine, the rest of the world is creating a coalition not against America, but that operates in the absence or without the participation of America. And that's bad for us for economic reasons.
And also bad for the world because we are still the engine of the world economically, at least for the moment, but definitely militarily. We still control the seas. And you said ruble, I say rubble, because that's what Europe's going to end in if the French president gets his way. So the rubble, the rubble, not the ruble, the rubble, Mark, because people now are acting independently of us. You've got China pushing closer and closer to Taiwan in the South Sea of China. You've got Netanyahu running amok in the Middle East. You have Saudi Arabia basically telling us to F off. And our four main candidates are named Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Tim Walz, and Vice President Harris, Kamala Harris. Forget the people at the top of the ticket on why this is the worst election of all time. Have you seen J.D. Vance or Tim Walz lately? Both of these human beings could be one heartbeat away from the presidency. Especially Walz. Walz makes Sarah Palin look like Abraham Lincoln. And J.D. Vance makes Dan Quayle look like he knew what he was doing. I said 4 years ago that this is a race to the bottom, but where I was mistaken is I didn't know how deep the bottom would be.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, our country isn't reliant upon the vice presidential candidates. Unless, of course, the Secret Service falls asleep on the job and we have to worry about the president vacating under extreme circumstances.
I would agree with you in part, but Trump is going to be the age Biden was when he started. There's a very high likelihood that his mental state deteriorates over the next few years, as does most people at that age, and you get J.D. Vance as president. On the other side, we already know that the Democratic Party, through Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, George Clooney, and the donor class from Hollywood, is more than willing to replace a president. So if Kamala Harris isn't doing the job the way they want it done, who's to say they're not just going to do this again? So I do think the vice presidential candidates are more important this time than they've been in a long time, given the fact that Trump is very old and seems more unstable by the day, and that Kamala Harris is simply your nominee because that's what George Clooney wanted.
Well, all I can say is it's a good thing we have elections every 4 years.
Well, we're not going to have another election, Mark, because if Trump wins, we all know he's going to go full Mussolini.
Yeah.
I mean, the guy who can't figure out how to run a campaign, the guy who couldn't figure out how to overturn his own election 4 years ago, he's somehow, in short order, going to turn America into a statist fascist state and line up all of his political opponents up against the wall and beat them with civilian Medal of Valor winners. I mean, is that how you do that?
If either of these candidates were 10% as bad as their opposition makes them out to be, I would leave the country. Because that would indeed be a scary place.
Oh, yeah. I would be climbing the wall and going down to Mexico and doing the jobs the Mexican people didn't want to do. I'd be out of here. Mark, the absurdness of what's being rammed down our throat this time, it is somehow more egregious than what's been being run down our throats for the last 8 years. Because everyone wants to think, I have a question for the Democratic Party supporters. If you really feel in your heart and you're voting your conscience against Trump, and I know you're against Trump because if you're going to vote for Harris and Walz, that means you'd literally vote for a ballot that says anyone but Trump. If Trump does not become the president again, what's your campaign going to be in 2024 or 2020? Is that going to be the most important election of all time? Is J.D. Vance going to be the new Hitler, or DeSantis, or whoever wins a Democratic primary? And if Trump does prevail, when he retires in 2020 or 2028 constitutionally, as he has to do, what are you running on then? You've gone so far It's like championship. It's like a professional wrestling. You've taken this game so far. Where does it go from here? And if you're the Republicans, basically now it's just the party of Trump. Where do you go from here in 4 years? So this election is only going to be the first part of the problem. In 4 years, someone's going to have to clean this mess up.
The Republicans also have a different question to answer, which is going to be a lot tougher, which is if Trump loses, what happens to the Republican Party? Because something happened this time around that hasn't happened, which is a former president maintained control of the Republican apparatus. Will he still be the de facto head of the Republican Party if he loses in November?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is he will, because he's the political head right now. And do you know who the head of the Republican National Committee is? Her name's Laura Trump, his daughter-in-law. So, Mark, if Trump loses, see, it's better if you hate Trump and you're the Democrats, I'd suggest you vote for Trump because he'll be gone in 2028. He really will be. Because if you don't, and Vice President Harris becomes
he never goes away.
He'll come back and run again at 82, and we all know that he will win the Republican primary. We know this. He'll be 82. He'll be like, Nikki Haley's stupid. DeSantis is a commie. Yeah, he'll win again.
So we need, for the sake of the country, we need to start a campaign that says, vote for Trump so he'll win and then go away.
Well, I've got the bumper sticker, Mark. I've got the slogan, woke for Trump. Right? If you want Trump to go away, suck it up, vote for him this time, and then he's done. Because I guarantee you this, whichever one of these two useless major political parties wins this election, the other party will win a landslide in 2028. It will reshape American politics for the next 30 years.
We've been speaking extemporaneously.